Good evening, everyone, and welcome to Affinity's final webinar episode for this year. What a year! Nevertheless, we have done it, and I must say first that the ancestors of some of us who are watching this show tonight took the land from the first people, the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, where we are now, its traditional custodians, and of other Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders around this country. And they have not got it back. We respect their loss, and we do what we can to redress it. My name's Alison Bronowski, and I'm a long-standing friend of Affinity, but I used to be a diplomat, and I was always a writer. I keep doing that, and I keep trying to pursue the ideas that I had in my working life, particularly through being Vice President of Australians for War Powers Reform, an organisation whose moment, it seems, has come just now. This year, as I said, and as you all know, has been a hell of a year. We're all affected by COVID-19, particularly the world much more than Australia, and we feel for people everywhere in that way. Still, Affinity, regardless, continued building its bridges and used the online technology that we have all now come to rely on. The first of the webinars began in Ramadan and had over 27 daily episodes to keep people going. There were conversations with facilitator John Cleary, who's a former ABC broadcaster, as you know, and TV presenter George Donegan, as well as many other hosts and guests and musicians joining us both nationally and internationally. We had, over the last 6 months, 20 more first-class webinars discussing a diverse range of topics in collaboration with 20 institutions and over 30 views, and we got over 30,000 views worldwide, which I think is pretty good. Let's take a look at the highlights of that.
I think as the leader of the government
with the United States is the US
featuring Muslim and Christians
that enhance social cohesion.
Peace operations and peace building provide hope to areas that are emerging from conflict.
What are the factors that contribute?
Trying to solve common problems.
Talk about a Human Rights Act, we tend to
must be preserved.
For those who have never attended an Affinity event before,
Affinity was formed some 20 years ago
by a group of young Muslim Australians
to promote multiculturalism and foster intercultural
and interfaith dialogue by building bridges between different groups in society.
So the warnings have been in since 1988. It's science.
Will help build the resilience of our environment to climate change.
Vulnerable parties need a court system that's flexible, accessible and adequately resourced.
And if we don't save each other and work together to save creation, then it'll all be destroyed.
Activating positive peace is generally community level.
To help make sure that every person that doesn't have a voice in this equation,
imams and other religious and faith leaders
get access to the key services that are available to them.
Generally looked upon to give advice and support.
Even if we doubled the humanitarian intake in Australia.
To all speak up about the deterioration of human rights.
In the world at the moment, you see
there's still so many displaced.
Where leadership is strong and you see where leadership's not strong and you look at the difference it makes on society.
There's a realization that the place for youth,
what is impacting on decreasing,
and it is a privileged space,
peacefulness globally is attitudes.
Still a very good opportunity for you to grow as a person.
And use that positive peace framing to think about what you can do.
There is no space for hate. There is no space for bigotry. There is no space for racism.
You are wonderful citizens which are contributing to the well-being of our state.
A, in your own community.
And the example you are setting.
B, in your own family unit.
Make sure that all of us stay safe and we keep our loved ones safe.
Or C, what you can do personally.
You're an example to the rest of the world about what multiculturalism means and how we can all be successful.
I have a responsibility to them.
This is the most extraordinary public health challenge.
As well as to everyone else, not just to my family.
That we have faced in 100 years.
Economic, social and cultural rights are also very important.
Especially this year, it's really an opportunity where we're all in the same storm. We might be in different boats.
These conversations are so important to promote the concept of togetherness, cross-cultural collaboration and of breaking down barriers that might otherwise but should never exist.
Really putting yourself out there in the university spaces.
That we can't use ethnicity or race
and utilising the online spaces that are provided for you
or religion as anchor points to be able to divide us.
Positive peace is an indication of a capacity of a country to be peaceful.
Well, there is an economic need for why we need to have a CEO who is Indian or Chinese.
There's only limited time in the day to be able to study and balance these other things.
But there is a moral case of saying, why not?
Crucial for your professional development.
We're yet to see culturally diverse representation at senior levels.
I mentioned that Affinity has presented with 20 first-class institutions in this current series, and that's made it very rich and productive for us. Tonight, we continue that by presenting in collaboration with the Institute of Economics and Peace. This is Affinity's fourth informative webinar episode with the IEP, the Institute for Economics and Peace. And like Affinity, the IEP promotes community harmony and social cohesion in one of the most culturally diverse states in the world. And I myself am particularly interested in seeing this particular episode because for the last 4 years, I think, I've been working on a book on terrorism. Terrorism is a huge subject, and the books on it stretch for miles and miles in library shelves, I can tell you. And I haven't read them all. I think Dr. Droogan has probably read them all, but I haven't. Nevertheless, I've just finished my book, and that is one of the reasons why it's so valuable for me tonight to hear about the latest issue of the Global Peace Index, which is an invaluable tool for terrorism studies, and to hear from our distinguished speakers in response to questions from everybody who's participating, because all of us can be affected by terrorism, and all of us have an interest in understanding it and wishing it to stop. So, without further ado, can I introduce tonight's facilitator, Dr. Julian Droogan.
Alison, thank you very, very much for your warm introduction and for all of the fantastic work that you do in this area of terrorism studies and also engaging with how we do counter terrorism in the 21st century. It's an absolute pleasure for me to be here again tonight with you all, wherever you might be in the world. I'm coming to you from Macquarie University in Sydney, Australia. And tonight we're going to be having an episode in collaboration with the Institute for Economics and Peace, the final webinar episode for the year in 2020. And as you said, Alison, what a year it has been. So tonight we'll be talking about terrorism, and in particular about the Global Terrorism Index. And this is an annual report produced by the Institute for Economics and Peace. It's now in its 8th edition. The Global Terrorism Index provides a very comprehensive summary of the key global trends and patterns in terrorism each year right around the world. It analyses a number of vital aspects of terrorism, such as the conditions under which terrorism occurs, how terrorism changes over time, and also the geopolitical drivers and the ideological aims of terrorist groups and individuals, as well as the strategies used by terrorists. The report covers a 50-year time span with an emphasis on trends over the last decade. So tonight we'll be discussing the 8th edition of the Global Terrorism Index, which is just being released now. We'll be discussing that with Senior Research Fellow and Chief Researcher on the Global Peace Index and the Global Terrorism Index, Thomas Morgan. Thomas has worked for the Institute for Economics and Peace since 2010, and in 2013 he was a visiting researcher at the Oxford Poverty and Human Development Initiative at the University of Oxford. Thomas, it's an absolute pleasure to have you with us here tonight, and we're all very much looking forward to your presentation on the 8th iteration of the Global Terrorism Index. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Julian, for that lovely introduction, and thank you very much to Affinity for having IEP back, and we're really looking forward to discussing the findings of this year's index. So tonight, yes, I'll be talking about the Global Terrorism Index, the 2020 Global Terrorism Index, which has just been released. The Global Terrorism Index, the aim of it is to look at trends, really macro trends in terrorism over the longer term, to look at those factors which lead to and contribute to terrorism, and then also to understand the economic impact of terrorism and look to emerging threats and different types of terrorism that we're seeing, that we've seen over the past few years. So if we could bring the presentation up. And go on to the next slide. So before we talk about the findings of the Global Terrorism Index this year, just a little bit about IEP. Really, IEP to study the intersection of peace, conflict, and economics, and really try and understand those factors that create and sustain peaceful societies. And really, it was born out of experiences of people trying to do development work and peace building work, and finding often that it was frustrated by conflict, and realizing that that connection between peace and development is so vital. And without peaceful societies, we really can't have the level of development that we're aiming for. So that's the background as to why IEP was formed and the kind of work that we're looking to do. So if we move on to the next slide. So we have offices across the world, but the research team for IEP is based here in Sydney, Australia. Our major research products are the Global Peace Index, the Global Terrorism Index, but then we also look at peace at the national level in a number of countries. We have a Mexico Peace Index, peace indices in the US and UK, and then we also have other papers looking at positive peace, which are those factors that create and sustain peaceful societies. So moving on to the next slide. The presentation tonight will be in two parts. The first part is looking at how we measure terrorism. So looking at how the index is constructed and what the results are for 2020. The second part of the presentation will be looking at trends in terrorism over the past 2 decades and looking at really what we're seeing are the emerging patterns in terrorism, with a particular focus of the shift in focus of ISIL from the Middle East and North Africa into sub-Saharan Africa, and then looking also at the rise of far-right extremism and far-right terrorism in the West in the context of emerging political unrest. So moving on to the next slide, the first question that we'll be addressing is, what is the Global Terrorism Index? How do we put it together? So we move on to the next slide. It just gives a brief summary of an overview of the index. It's in its 8th year. It ranks 163 countries, which covers 99% of the world's population. Originally, the Global Terrorism Index was an indicator just in the Global Peace Index, but then it was expanded out to be its own piece of research and its own index. It was developed by the Institute for Economics and Peace in Sydney, and the data that we use for the index is a data set called the Global Terrorism Database. It's produced by an organization called START, which is based in the University of Maryland in the US. So how do we construct the index? If we go on to the next slide, it gives a little overview of the methodology. The first thing we do is we take the START database, which began in 1970 and covers all the way up to 2019, is the most recent period of data. Events in that database are coded mainly from media reports, and they collect a whole range of variables related to terrorism: how many people were killed, how many people were injured, what type of attack, where it was, the group responsible, and so on. And so we take some of those variables from the index, from the data set, and combine them to form the index. So we give each of those variables a different weighting. So the index takes into account deaths, injuries, incidents, and property damage from terrorism. We also wanted the index to reflect the fact that the impact of terrorism isn't just limited to 1 year. Terrorism has lingering psychological and social effects. And so if you were just to have an index that had scores only for 1 year, you would find also that scores would jump around considerably from year to year, and it wouldn't reflect this lingering psychological and social effect that terrorism has. So we have a 5-year weighting, with the most recent year weighted the most heavily, and then going back across the previous 4 years. We also use a specialized banding system, because if you looked at just at the distribution of deaths from terrorism, for example, you would find that some countries have thousands and thousands more deaths from terrorism and thousands more incidents. And if you were trying to reflect this on a single scale, you would find that you would have most of the countries in the world clustered at the bottom of the index, and very few countries with very high scores on the index. The other reason to use that banding system is to reflect the fact that the impact of terrorism changes with the level of terrorism. And that we see this reflected perhaps in the media coverage of terrorism, that if you have a relatively stable country with very few incidents of terrorism, when you do have an incident of terrorism, it tends to have a much larger impact and shock than in a country where you have more incidents and more deaths from terrorism. And it becomes less unusual. It becomes something that becomes part of the fabric of the society, so to speak. And so our banding system reflects that. And then, of course, we take the index and then we correlate that against a number of socio-economic indicators to try and identify those factors which lead to terrorism. So if we move on to the next slide. So just a quick overview of the results for the 2020 GTI. So here we have a map which shows where terrorism is concentrated throughout the world. The countries most affected by terrorism tend to be in the Middle East and North Africa, and also in sub-Saharan Africa. If you note, the countries in the pale greenish color are those countries which score a 0 on the index. And to score a 0, that means that a country has to have had no incidents of terrorism at all in the last 5 years. So when we look at the 163 countries, there were only 29 countries that didn't have at least one incident from terrorism over the past 5 years. So we're moving on to the next slide, which gives an overview of the countries which are most impacted by terrorism in the 2020 GTI. Afghanistan is the country that's most impacted by terrorism. It remains the country most impacted by terrorism. But for most of the past 2 decades, it has been Iraq. It's only in the last 2 years that Afghanistan became the country that ranked at the top of the index. And we also see Nigeria, Syria, Somalia, Yemen, Pakistan, India, the Democratic Republic of the Congo, and the Philippines in the top 10. One important thing to note is that every single one of those countries is involved in at least one conflict. And one of the key findings of the report is that conflict and terrorism go hand in hand. 96% of all deaths from terrorism actually occur in countries involved in at least one conflict. So often the terrorism gets a lot of attention when it happens in countries outside of conflict, but really the most common form of terrorism is as a tactic within an existing conflict. So if we move on to the next slide, just gives a brief summary of the change in terrorism from 2018 to 2019. We found that there was a 15.5% reduction in deaths from terrorism between 2018 and 2019. And this is really following the trend that we've seen over the past 5 years. Deaths from terrorism peaked in 2014 when there were just under 34,000 deaths from terrorism. But every year since then, we've seen a decline in the number of deaths. And as you can see from the chart there, the majority of deaths are concentrated in just a handful of countries, which if we go on to the next slide, we can see in more detail. So there are the top 10 countries in the world with the most deaths account for 81% of all deaths from terrorism in 2019. Terrorism is very unequally distributed. And we find that one country, Afghanistan, accounted for 41% of all deaths from terrorism in 2019. So if we move on to the next slide, it looks at the countries which have had the largest decreases in deaths from terrorism. And what you can see is there, it's the countries which are at the top of the index, which actually had the biggest reductions in terrorism over the past year. So in Afghanistan, Nigeria, Iraq, and Syria, which are all ranked very highly on the index, they had the largest decreases in deaths. And one of the interesting findings on the index this year is the countries which had the largest increase in deaths, which we see on the next slide. So the countries that had the largest increases in deaths from terrorism in 2019, of those 10 countries, 7 of those are in sub-Saharan Africa. And that's really one of the key themes of the report, is that shift in terrorist activity, particularly from ISIL, out of the Middle East and North Africa and into sub-Saharan Africa. So Burkina Faso had the largest increase. Sri Lanka had the second largest increase, and you see also New Zealand is on that list at number 9. In both of those countries, that came from a single terrorist incident. So the Christchurch mosque attacks for New Zealand, and then the Easter Sunday bombings in Sri Lanka, a single terrorist event which was responsible for 265 deaths. So that's just a very brief summary of the results of the index and how it's constructed. And that's the end of part 1 of the report. Part 2 will go into a lot more detail in the trends over the past 2 decades. And then, as I said, special focus on sub-Saharan Africa and far-right extremism, and start to get in looking into some of the circumstances around terrorism and the drivers of terrorism. But I think we have some discussion now on how the index is constructed.
Oh, thank you very much, Thomas, for that overview. And I'm going to ask you some questions now, which people in the audience might be thinking about when they listen to your extraordinarily interesting and also say quite heartening presentation, since terrorist incidents do seem to be going downwards in much of the world. But it begs the question: how do you, as an organisation that has a global focus, how do you define terrorism effectively? As we know, terrorism is defined very differently in different countries. Some countries, if you're of a particular political or religious persuasion, you might be considered a terrorist. Nelson Mandela, as we know, the former president of South Africa, was arrested on terrorism charges. How do you define terrorism in one way around the world? And do you define terrorist attacks that maybe were failed or that were foiled by law enforcement at the last minute?
It's a very good question, and yes, I mean the definition of terrorism, it's not only contested in an academic or theoretical sense, it also has very important, as you mentioned, political ramifications. So it's something that we took great care in when trying to construct a definition. And there's certainly there's a lot of discussion around whether a certain organisation qualifies as a terrorist group or not. The definition that we use tries to circumvent some of those issues by really focusing on terrorism as a tactic. So the unit of account for the database, it's not the group per se, it's the event. So it's a consideration of whether a certain event can be classified as terrorism. And there are a number of criteria that need to be fulfilled in order to be considered terrorism. It has to be a violent act by a non-state actor. So the definition just off the bat excludes actions by states. It has to be designed to intimidate or coerce a wider audience outside of the immediate impact of the act, which is what distinguishes it from, say, just a battle or a gunfight or conflict between two parties. And that act that aim to coerce or intimidate has to be for economic, political, or religious reasons. So those are the sort of the given ideological motivations that are considered terrorism. And what that excludes from the definition is organized crime, primarily. So if you look at a country like Mexico, where there's a great deal of violence, which in its form is certainly designed to coerce and intimidate, but because that kind of violence is carried out by organized criminal groups for the most part, that's not counted as terrorism within the START database. As to the question on whether failed or foiled attacks are included, if an attack fails or is foiled in its act of being carried out, then it is included in the index, and that's one of the variables that's coded for whether it was a successful terrorist attack or not. Unfortunately, we're not able to include foiled attacks in the sense of being foiled in the lead up or interrupted by intelligence services or security services. We have in the past attempted to construct data sets which look at foiled attacks. The problem there is not necessarily on collecting the information that's out there on foiled attacks, it's whether you know that that's a representative sample of actual foiled attacks, so to speak, that tend to be less media attention. So it's really harder then, we have less certainty when we're talking about trends in foiled attacks and so on. It's less reliable data. It's something we try to include, but it's not part of START's global terrorism database.
Thank you for that. You mentioned that that states are excluded in your definition of terrorism. States, cannot be terrorist actors. But you also mentioned that terrorism tends to occur in conflict zones most prevalently. And that brings me on to the next question, which is, have you ever thought to compare the numbers of people that have been killed during the war on terrorism, as opposed to the number of people that have been killed by terrorists themselves? And if not, why is that sort of comparison not included?
It's not included as part of the terrorism index itself, but it is very much a part of the other types of research that IEP does, and really that the main report that IEP does every year, the Global Peace Index, draws together all those different forms of violence: terrorism, conflict death, state-sponsored terrorism, interpersonal violence, all those different types, and really considers them on an even footing to all be types of violence that need to be included and recorded in the Global Peace Index, and then also to look at them, to compare them, to look at the relative impact of terrorism versus conflict deaths, and so on. So it's certainly a comparison that we make, but it's not one that's made within the confines of the terrorism report. We're really looking at, just by excluding states, it lets us focus on that definition. We're looking at organizations which don't have a theoretical monopoly on the use of violence. So it's very bound in that sense.
That makes a lot of sense. I can see how those other issues would be included in your positive peace index and so on. It's great news that the terrorist incidents seem to be declining in much of the world, and certainly the cessation of major hostilities in places like Iraq and Syria certainly seems to be contributing to that. However, people who are sort of casual in this space and maybe don't pay a lot of attention might think, well, then why do we still see so much news activity and media activity sort of focused on terrorism in the daily pages of our news feeds? Why is terrorism still something that we are so concerned about, certainly in countries like Australia, at least?
I think that's a very good question, and part of that comes down to the way in which any sensationalistic and violent events are covered. They get a lot of attention. They're newsworthy, perhaps in a disproportionate sense to their actual impact. But I think also we need to think about what type of violence terrorism is and what distinguishes it from other forms of violence, because terrorism, relatively speaking, gets, even higher coverage than, say, homicide or violent crime or conflict deaths and so on. I think that really goes to the heart of what terrorism is, and that part of the definition where it's about looking to coerce or intimidate. Terrorism, by definition, makes a spectacle of itself. So in that sense, it's impossible for it not to be covered. And I think that's why we have in the index as well, we have the logarithmic banding scale to reflect the fact that element of spectacle and that element of coercion and intimidation is even higher in countries which have lower levels of terrorism. It comes as a greater interruption to everyday life, so to speak. And I think that's part of the reason why that you have so much attention placed on terrorism in countries which don't have high levels of terrorism, and also set amongst the broader trend of rapidly declining total numbers of deaths and incidents from terrorism.
Fantastic. I think that very good answer really does walk into the next question that I was going to ask you. However, and that question really comes to the heart again of that definition of terrorism as a way of creating a spectacle that is able to instill fear in an audience. It's once upon a time it was said that terrorists like many people watching as opposed to many people dead. They're more concerned about their audiences than the number of people they necessarily might kill. And that, of course, brings up the equation, the factor in that equation of media, for them to be able to really advertise what they do and to create that fear and leverage off that fear. They need media to report it. And so for people like myself who write on terrorism as academics, and for people in media who write stories about terrorism, a real issue is, well, how do we write about terrorism and communicate about terrorism without sensationalizing it and also contributing to that cycle that terrorists rely on in spreading fear and spreading the spectacle of their attacks? And is that something you discuss at the Institute of Economics and Peace? And how do you manage that in your reporting?
It's a very good question, and I think absolutely it's 100% a contributing factor to the success of terrorist groups in being able to survive and to attract more recruits and so on. We have a small section in the report which focuses on that. The three factors which drive terrorist group success are the ability to recruit, the ability to have influence and finance, but also their profile, so to speak. It's very much a part of the equation for terrorist group success, which means that yes, the coverage of terrorism needs to be especially sensitive. The way that the Institute tries to deal with that is by having a focus on the data and what the data is saying, and not trying to be as trying to not to sensationalize it as much as possible with a focus on the data. Now, of course, by the mere act of talking about terrorism and reporting on it, you are, to a certain extent, forwarding the aims of terrorist groups. And I think that's unavoidable if you want to talk about it at all. However, I think in the broader media climate, there is a reflection of the fact that terrorism can be covered in a way that is focused on the victims rather than the perpetrators. I think particularly after the Christchurch attacks, there was a concerted effort by the media not to draw attention to the perpetrator, not to use his name, not to publish images or sections of his manifesto and so on. So I think there's a growing awareness in the media of the importance of non-sensationalized coverage of terrorism.
I would agree with you with that, and I certainly think that the work that you do, which is data-driven, and you have a very clear definition of terrorism as a tactic, does a really good job of being able to talk about and inform people about terrorism while not sensationalizing it and being an overt part of that cycle that terrorists rely on. Should we get back to the second half of the presentation and have a bit more of a discussion after that?
Absolutely. So if we look at the next section of the presentation, we're looking at the trends and challenges, starting by looking at the trends in terrorism over the past 2 decades. And as Julian said, really the key take-home of the report is that it's been a relatively good news story over the past 5 years. We've seen a 59% reduction in deaths from terrorism from 2014 to 2019, really coming about as a result of the military defeat of ISIL in Syria, a fall in the associated terrorism from ISIL in Iraq and Syria, a reduction in the level of terrorism in Nigeria. And then even though the level of terrorism in Afghanistan was growing up until very recently, even in Afghanistan, which is the country most impacted by terrorism, we saw a fall in the number of deaths and the total number of incidents from 2018 to 2019, with hopefully that set to continue into 2020, although it's too early to say. So if we move on to the next slide, what we find with these trends is that there has been a shift away from the Middle East and North Africa, which had the highest number of deaths by far in terrorism from 2012 to 2017. But then there's been that shift, firstly into South Asia, in Afghanistan, but also to a lesser extent in Pakistan. And then there was a large spike in deaths in sub-Saharan Africa in 2014, which could mostly be attributed to Boko Haram in Nigeria. But then what we've seen over the last year is that there has been a rise in what we would call mid-intensity terrorism. So countries with not over 1,000 deaths, but between 100 and 1,000 deaths from terrorism. Lots of countries in that situation now in sub-Saharan Africa. So if we move on quickly just to look at the deadliest terrorist groups, the groups that were responsible for the highest number of deaths. For much of the past 5 years, that's been ISIL. They've been overtaken by the Taliban, which is now the terrorist group in the world which has the highest number of deaths attributed to it. Number of deaths attributed to Boko Haram has fallen considerably. And there's also been a steady but smaller rise in the number of deaths attributed to Al-Shabaab, mostly in Somalia. If we look at the next slide, it shows the distribution of deaths from terrorism. That is, the number of countries that experienced at least one death, countries with, as I said, mid-intensity terrorism, and then the number of countries with over 1,000 deaths from terrorism. And so those countries with the extreme ranges at the end of the distribution with over 1,000 deaths, that's been falling. But there are still a large number of countries which have had at least one death from terrorism. So in 2019, there were 63 countries that recorded at least one death from terrorism. So even though that's the lowest number since 2013, it's still an issue that affects a large number of countries. If we move on to the next slide, it just illustrates where these deaths are happening. And so, as I said before, 96% of deaths from terrorism occur in countries involved in a conflict, which you see in the first two charts there, the war and minor armed conflict. So as the level of conflict in Syria and in other countries has dropped off, the number of deaths from terrorism has plummeted in a war situation, which means that there are over 1,000 battle deaths from terrorism. However, in minor armed conflict, we're seeing that number trend up, which is a reflection of, as I said, that sort of medium intensity terrorism, mostly in sub-Saharan Africa. And then deaths that occur in non-conflict countries have dropped considerably as well, although there was a slight uptick between 2018 and 2019. So if we move on to the next slide, the last part of the presentation looks at the shifting landscape of terrorism. So even though terrorism has gone down, we're seeing new threats emerge in different regions. The past decade was the deadliest on record for terrorism that we had, since with over 182,000 terrorism deaths between 2010 and 2019, compared to 72,000 in the decade prior. So there was a huge increase, and as you can see from the chart, it was mostly in the Middle East and North Africa, South Asia, and sub-Saharan Africa. And in fact, if you exclude those three regions, the number of deaths from terrorism actually went down between the 2000s and the 2010s. And if we move on to the next slide, we can see that a lot of that, even though there was that sharp increase in the 2010s, most of that was concentrated in the first 5 years of the decade. And then over the past 5 years, we've seen a considerable drop in terrorist activity that's attributed to ISIL. But the largest drop has come from deaths and attacks attributed to what we call core ISIL, which is ISIL operating in Syria and Iraq. Then ISIL has a number of provinces, which are groups which are formally affiliated with ISIL. They have a certain leadership structure and pledge allegiance in a certain way, and that's what makes them provinces. And then, of course, there are affiliate attacks, which are from groups and individuals who pledge allegiance to ISIL but don't have that formal connection and link to core ISIL. So even as deaths attributed to core ISIL have been going down, the number of deaths attributed to its provinces and to its affiliates has been increasing. So if we move on to the next slide, we can also see that even though the level of ISIL activity has dropped considerably, and in fact, for the first time since the group was formed, ISIL recorded less than 1,000 deaths from terrorism in 2019. Even though there's been that reduction, its provinces and affiliates are operating in a number of countries across the world. There were 27 countries outside of Iraq and Syria that recorded an attack, recorded at least one attack from an ISIL affiliate or province in 2019. And we can see there's also been a shift in the distribution of deaths from ISIL as well, which we see on the next slide. So up until recently, the majority of ISIL activity was concentrated in the Middle East and North Africa. Up until 2014, that was almost 100% of deaths that were attributed to ISIL. But we've seen the shift into South Asia, with provinces of ISIL active in Afghanistan and to a lesser extent in Pakistan, but then also the more recent shift into sub-Saharan Africa. And you can see that the sharp increase in the percentage of ISIL deaths in sub-Saharan Africa from 2018 to 2019. So as we said at the start of the presentation, 7 of the 10 countries with the largest increase in deaths are in sub-Saharan Africa, mostly concentrated in the Sahel region, mostly concentrated in areas where there's poor state provision of services and security services in border regions, rural regions. That's where the majority of ISIL activity is concentrated. But it's not just in the Sahel. We're starting to see it even further and further south in sub-Saharan Africa. And in fact, one of the largest increases in ISIL activity in 2019 occurred in Mozambique. So they're starting to see more of a shift of ISIL southward down into the southern parts of sub-Saharan Africa. So the other trend that we examined in the report was the rise of far-right terrorism and political violence more generally, or far-right terrorism occurring within the context of increasing political unrest and political violence. So if we move on to the next slide, for the purposes of the report, we were looking in particular at far-right terrorism in Western Europe, in North America, in Australia and New Zealand. So that's the focus of the report, that's what we're referring to when we say far-right terrorism. So to put it in context, there's been a 250% increase in far-right terrorist attacks over the past 5 years. The majority of that occurring in the US, but also with considerable rises in a number of countries in Western Europe, and then of course with the horrific attacks in Christchurch in 2019 as well. So what's driving this? Why has this been happening, and how does that compare to previous periods where we've seen an increase in far-right terrorism? So if we look at the next slide, we've seen that in the West, there's been a shift in the number of deaths away from religiously motivated towards politically motivated terrorism. So in 2019, for the first time in a few years, you had more deaths from politically motivated terrorism than religiously motivated terrorism in the West. But if we look at the number of incidents, there's actually always been, over the past two decades, or going back to 2002, there have always been more political terrorist incidents than religiously motivated incidents. It's just that the majority of those resulted in no deaths. They were small attacks, and so the number of incidents wasn't reflected in the number of deaths. But in 2019, we're starting to see in the West the rise of political terrorism and the waning of religious terrorism. So if we move on to the next slide, which puts the increase in far-right terrorism into context over the last 50 years. So as we said, from 2014 to 2019, there's been a 250% increase. And even though there is a history of far-right terrorism in the West, many instances in the 1970s and 1980s and 1990s before falling off until 2010, over the past few years, we've seen record high numbers of far-right terrorist incidents in the West. So if we move on to the next slide, and just briefly discuss where that's happening. So if we look at the number of incidents, it's mostly that far-right terrorism is mostly concentrated in the United States. We're also seeing a significant number of incidents in Germany, in the UK, in France, and Sweden, and then a handful in other countries. But when it comes to the distribution of deaths, because most deaths from terrorism occur in single large events, we've seen the majority of deaths from far-right terrorism have occurred in the US, but then the second highest number in Norway, and then third highest number in New Zealand. So overall, from 2002 to 2019, we saw 332 far-right terrorist incidents and 286 deaths in the West. And one of the interesting things about far-right terrorism is that it's far more likely to be carried out by lone actors, by lone wolves, by individuals who are not affiliated with a particular terrorist group. So if we move on to the next slide, it shows the percentage of terrorist incidents that were carried out by somebody, whether they were formally affiliated with a terrorist group or whether they were unaffiliated, and then looks at that by ideology. So if you see for most separatist terrorist attacks, separatist nationalist terrorist attacks, the majority of those were carried out by individuals who are affiliated with a group. The same with far-left terrorism and environmental terrorism. But when you look at far-right, and Islamist terrorism, it's much more likely to be unaffiliated with a particular group, much more likely to be lone actors carrying out the terrorist acts. And if you look at that chart just for the last year, you would find that almost 100% of far-right terrorist incidents are carried out by individuals who are unaffiliated with a particular terrorist group. And even for the other types of terrorism, such as far-left and separatist, it's now becoming increasingly common for those kind of attacks to be carried out by individuals unaffiliated with a group. If we look on to the next chart, we'll just talk a little bit about some of the background conditions associated with this rise in far-right terrorism. And one of the most worrying things we found that outside of other than the sheer number of incidents, far-right terrorist incidents, is that this is occurring in a context where violence is becoming more common, certain types of violence is becoming more common, more politicized, and more accepted or seen as more inevitable. This chart shows the number of mass shootings in the US from 1982 to 2019. And so over that whole time period, found that 22% of those mass shooting events could be classified as terrorism. But what we found is that number increases to almost between 35 and 40% looking at the past few years. So there's been an increase in this type of rampage killing, mass shooting, but increasingly those killings are being politicized, whereas previously they were done for no known motivation or carried out it's say, for example, in a workplace, in an act of revenge. Increasingly, those types of attacks are becoming driven by political motivations. And one of the most, I think, disturbing findings from the report is reflected on the next slide, which is the increase in the acceptance of violence for political ends This is data from the US. We didn't have the data for elsewhere, but I wouldn't be surprised to find this finding reflected in other countries, although probably not to the same extent, which has found that over the past 3 years, the number of respondents, both Democrats and Republicans, who say that they feel that violence for political ends is at least partially justified, has increased from around 8% for both Democrats and Republicans in November 2017, to over 35% of Republicans and just under 35% of Democrats in May 2020. It's a quite astonishing rise in the acceptance of political violence, of violence for political ends, even if it's people saying that they feel it's just partially justified. So that's a sort of brings to an end the part 2 of the report, and it's a very quick trip through the findings of the 2020 Global Terrorism Index. And I would encourage anyone who's found this interesting and wants to dig into it more to go to IAP's website and download the full report. But I think now is a chance to expand a bit more upon some of those themes, Julian.
Engaging and very fascinating report. I really enjoy the IEP reports. I love that they are data-driven and they give us these really large macroscopic views to understand how terrorism is changing on a year-by-year basis all around the world. So thank you so much for that. I'm going to start with a question about Africa. What on earth is going on in sub-Saharan Africa, Thomas? I mean, you mentioned affiliates and groups that are aligned with Islamic State. I mean, is Islamic State in Africa? Is it moving to Africa? Or is Islamic State really just hijacking a series of pre-existing, political and other conflicts that have already been going on in Africa and just sort of rebranding it as Islamic State? I mean, can you shed some light on this very complex situation?
I think it's very much the latter. Yes, it's not a situation where core ISIL is redirecting fighters and resources from Syria and Iraq into sub-Saharan Africa. Although ISIL has had a stated aim of expanding into sub-Saharan Africa since 2016, and there was a period where it was redirecting resources, redirecting fighters away from Iraq and Syria into other regions. For a period, it was telling would-be foreign fighters to travel to the Philippines instead of to Syria and so on. But as you said, the situation in sub-Saharan Africa is a little bit different. What we're seeing there is that you usually have a pre-existing conflict, often over resources, often involving different ethnic groups, often in a region, as I mentioned before, in the borders between countries, in regions where there's very poor state provision of services. And so you have these existing conflicts, which then become folded into a larger ideological conflict. And as you said, it's ISIL, but also Al-Qaeda as well, becoming involved in those kind of conflicts, not starting them, but essentially, as you said, taking them over. The reason for that is often you have some of these smaller groups, be they ethnic groups or jihadi-inspired terrorist groups, who are targeted by security services, counterterrorism operations. They lose their leaders, and then in order to survive, they turn towards ISIL. They pledge allegiance, they get access to certain networks, logistics support, know-how, and so on. And that's one of the reasons that we're seeing this increase in ISIL-affiliated activity in ISIL provinces in sub-Saharan Africa. And then the other reason is that, and we'll touch upon this a little bit later, I think, when we're talking about lone wolf attacks and unaffiliated and affiliated, is that ISIL's, I really hesitate to use the term brand, but that's perhaps the best analogy, is very strong. It's a very potent recruiting tool for these groups. It allows recruits to feel that they are folded up, drawn into this much larger global ideological conflict. And in that sense, it's a powerful recruiting tool. So I think that's what's happening with the rise of ISIL in sub-Saharan Africa.
Right. So when this so-called self-styled, Islamic State movement comes into one of these conflicts, conflicts in Africa, say, it's able to reinvigorate that conflict by bringing its branding and its expertise and so on. But at the same time, I guess it reinvigorates its own brand by showing geographical, distance and its ability to act in different continents and different parts of the world. It really is a devilish form of sort of hybridization, isn't it?
Absolutely, and I think it's very novel in the field. I think you haven't really seen that with any other, even with political terrorist movements before. They'd be tied to an ideology, but not to a particular terrorist organization, terrorist group in the same way. So it's quite unique in that sense.
I want to ask you a question now, coming more, I suppose, onto the far right side of things, although I might certainly expand over other forms of terrorism as well. You mentioned before the radicalization of politics, in places like the United States of America. We've also seen what you said before, the politicization of violence as well, where once upon a time someone might have been violent for a purely personal reason. Now it's sort of taking on a veneer of politics when those lone actors, perpetrate their violence. What we're looking at here, is it a form of tit for tat? Are we looking at what some people are calling cumulative extremism, where one form of violent extremism starts to create the conditions for the next? And what I mean by that is, ISIL or ISIS attacks sort of providing fuel for far-right narratives, and then far-right attacks providing fuel for far-left violent, sort of counter-protests and counter-attacks. And through this, are we seeing a cumulative radicalization of politics in the West and of violence?
Yeah, yes, I think that's fair to say. I think there are sort of two pairings there. There's the relationship of far-right terrorism to Islamist terrorism, and then there's the relation of far-right political violence to far-left political violence, which for the most part doesn't take the form of terrorist activity, but as you said, it's more likely to involve street battles, that kind of street-level violence in the context of an ongoing protest in a particular location. And I think in that sense, yes, the far left and the far right very much feed off each other. Their narratives around their own identity very much rely upon having the far left or the far right to counter themselves too. And it's a similar kind of dynamic when it comes to far right radicalization compared to Islamist radicalization and Islamist terrorism. Certainly with the Christchurch attacks, that was very much an issue with the perpetrators' stated motivation. And then you see one of the reasons claimed for the Sri Lanka Easter Sunday bombings was in response to the Christchurch attacks. Very often in the kind of material, radicalization material we see from Islamist-inspired organizations and from far-right organizations, it's very much part of the narrative. It's not the only factor. I wouldn't want to say that that's the sole driving force. But it's certainly a contributing factor to the increase in these types of violence that we've seen.
Yeah, so it's a very worrying phenomenon and a very worrying cycle, isn't it? When you look at it at that perspective. And again, I think that's one of the things that the Institute for Economics and Peace's Terrorism Index really brings to the conversation, that bird's eye view. So thank you for that, Thomas. I think we have time for maybe one more quick question before we close this extraordinarily interesting and fascinating discussion. Just a general question. I'm going to open up to you to speculate wildly, if you don't mind. What do you think? What do you think about the effects of COVID-19? How will COVID-19 and this extraordinary year that's about to close, how will that affect terrorism going forward? In your humble opinion, Thomas.
Well, it's a very interesting question, because we do have some preliminary data from 2020 on what has happened to lots of different forms of violence, and because it's preliminary, some of it is being gathered in a sort of anecdotal fashion. I wouldn't want to be too strong in affirming these trends, but I think you can tentatively say that there has been a decrease as a result of the pandemic in many types of violence, in terrorism, in conflict deaths, interpersonal violence, homicide. Some types of violence, of course, have increased as a result of the lockdown, domestic violence, that kind of form of interpersonal violence. But many types of violence have decreased. But I fear that, and also, of course, at least in the first few months of 2020, there was an associated decrease in civil unrest, riots and demonstrations and so on. That didn't last, but at least for the first few months, that's what we were seeing. So the initial result of the pandemic was to see a quite remarkable drop in different forms of violence. However, of course, what is yet to be determined is the full social and political consequences of the pandemic and associated lockdowns. You're starting to see more and more civil unrest brewing. I think you're starting to see a lot of anti-lockdown movements emerging in Europe. So there will be that sort of direct civil unrest, which is related to the COVID-19 pandemic. But then, of course, there's the consequences of the astonishing economic uncertainty and economic volatility that we're seeing as a result of the pandemic. And that's the thing that really will play out over the next 6 months to a year. As stimulus measures and recovery measures start to taper off, you start to have more people being unemployed, more so in certain countries than others. But you take the US, for example, I think there was, in the early months of the pandemic, there's something like an astonishing 6 million new unemployment claims, completely unprecedented in the history of those statistics in the US as a one-off event. Now, the social and economic consequences of that, will that lead to more civil unrest, more political violence? You can never be too sure exactly what form that will take, but I think you can be fairly confident that there will be some fairly significant social ramifications. When that comes to its effect on terrorism, that's harder to say. So even though terrorism is a very serious form of violence, it's also, I think it's important to state that it is actually a rare form of violence, even though it has serious consequences. And it's not simply a linear progression from there being economic unrest to civil unrest to suddenly this mass surge in terrorist attacks and people being radicalized. But certainly the conditions that help contribute to radicalization are getting worse and will be made worse by the pandemic. So it's certainly a worrying sign on the impact of terrorism in 2021.
Yes, you're right. There's never a clear one-to-one relationship, is there? But we can certainly see the beginnings already, I think, of certain crisis narratives taking on a national or global reach. Phenomena like the QAnon phenomena, I think, very clearly show the anxiety of populations right now and that ability for that to transform into violence quite easily. Thank you so much for that, Thomas. I think it's been an absolutely brilliant presentation. I hope everyone's enjoyed it wherever you might be around the world watching it. Again, thank you so much for your extraordinarily informative thoughts and your answers to the questions tonight. Before we call upon the closing remarks, however, this evening, we do have a video message from the founder and the executive chairman for the Institute of Economics and Peace, Steve Kalea. So please stay with me now for that message.
I'd like to welcome you to this presentation on the Global Terrorism Index, which will be given by Thomas Morgan, who's the Senior Researcher at the Institute for Economics and Peace and headed up the research for the Global Terrorism Index. Now, I think this is the fourth event which we've done this year with Affinity, and I think the total audience has been about 1,200. All of them have been virtual, and in this virtual age, I think Affinity's done an excellent job on being able to get its message through. But more important than that, the work of Affinity, I think, is really key and really important for global peace. We can see when we look at a lot of the issues in the world, even if we look at, let's say, Ethiopia, Yemen, which are two of the bigger issues at the moment, that intercultural dialogue and the ability to be able to bring groups together is key for achieving global peace. And the work of Affinity plays right into that ground, really centrally. Anyway, I hope you enjoy your conference. I'm sure it'll be very, very good. And thank you.
Thank you very much for your message, Steve. To end the night, I'd like to call upon Affinity's Executive Director, Amit Pollitt, to present the closing remarks. Thank you.
Thank you, Cousin Julian. Good evening, distinguished viewers and my newly extended families, uncles, aunties, cousins. Affinity's collaboration with Institute for Economics and Peace tonight stands as a proof of thought, support, advocate, and action of peace on a mission to spread in our communities, making Australia and the world a better place. In my view, Affinity and IEP is in a constant and continuous state of positive and proactive action while favoring a worldview that brings together on shared humanity. It is with this thought that I would like to mention how grateful Affinity is to have a partner with IEP and present 4 webinar episodes this year to promote global positive peace. We hope to bring many more events with IEP in the year 2021. I'd like to sincerely thank our inspiring activists of tonight, Cousins Thomas and Julian. Thank you, Cousin Thomas, for your informative presentation, and Cousin Julian for fantastically facilitating all of the IEP webinar episodes. I'd like to extend my sincere thanks to Cousin Charlie for his extraordinary efforts in the first 3 webinars, and my esteemed friend Steve Clelia for your wonderful message. Finally, thank you, Her Excellency Alison Branowski, for the warm welcoming. As seen tonight, terrorism is the greatest blow to peace, democracy, and humanity, and it is to be always condemned no matter by whom it is carried out or for what purpose it is committed. Violence and terror violate the principle of the essential dignity of human beings and must be condemned unconditionally, regardless of the circumstance. Every human was created as worthy, and every human life is sacred, no matter their beliefs. The Holy Quran mentions, "He who kills a soul for murder or for causing disorder and corruption on the earth will be as if he had killed all humankind. And he who saves a life will be as if he had saved the lives of all humankind." Peaceful and harmonious coexistence is the ultimate ideal that unites all of humanity. As my dear friend Steve mentioned in his newly published book, Peace in the Age of Chaos, it is about the realization that peace is at the heart of a sustainable future, because without peace, we will never be able to obtain the levels of international trust, cooperation, and inclusiveness necessary to solve our global challenges. To conclude, I believe building bridges of peace and friendship is possibly by committing to accept everybody in their respective positions and preparing a seat for everyone in our hearts. Distinguished viewers, we have come to the end of Affinity's final webinar of 2020. It has been my utmost pleasure to host you on our virtual platform, and I would like to thank you all for your time and support. I'd like to send my special thanks to my cousin Matthew. With his help, Affinity has been able to present first-class webinars to your screens at home. Although it has been very difficult, this year is very special for Affinity. Celebrating its 20th year anniversary, we have broken records with 50 events and more than 30,000 views, and have welcomed speakers and viewers from around the globe. Our main drive and motivation are to promote and live peace through sharing universal values, embracing and loving all of humanity, and continuing to building friendship bridges virtually and physically. I hope to host you all in the year 2021 with new innovative ideas and events, and continue to walk together on the path of global peace. Have a lovely, peaceful evening. Thank you.